For as long as I could remember, my life had been a model of order and discipline. My name is Jonathan Hayes, and for the past 17 years, I've served as a district court judge in the quiet town of Maplewood. My home, a modest yet elegant colonial in the Willow Creek Estates community, was my sanctuary. It was where I could escape the weight of the courtroom and immerse myself in the simple joys of life, gardening, reading, and, most importantly, restoring my father's 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 302. The Mustang wasn't just a car, it was a piece of my soul. My father, a mechanic with a passion for classic cars, had left it to me when he passed away 6 years ago. Restoring it had been a labor of love, a way to honor his memory and preserve the bond we shared. The car was a gleaming masterpiece, a deep emerald green with chrome accents that caught the sunlight like liquid silver. It was my pride and joy, a symbol of my father's legacy. But all that changed one Tuesday morning. I was heading to work when I noticed a white envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. My heart sank as I unfolded the letter. It was a violation notice from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA, signed by none other than Victoria Langston, the HOA president. Vehicle in violation of community aesthetic standards, the notice read. Must be stored in a garage or removed from the property within 48 hours. I was stunned. My driveway was spacious, the car was immaculate, and there was nothing in the HOA bylaws that prohibited classic cars from being parked in driveways. I decided to call the HOA office to clarify the situation. Victoria answered the phone herself. Her voice was cold and clipped. Mr. Hayes, the board has recently reinterpreted Section 8.3 regarding vehicles of unusual appearance. Your Mustang falls under that category. The decision is final unless overturned at the next quarterly meeting, which is 3 months away. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. Victoria, I've reviewed the covenants, and there's nothing that prohibits restored classic cars from being parked in driveways. I'd like to request a special meeting to address this interpretation. Her response was swift and dismissive. Request denied. The board is not obligated to hold special meetings for individual complaints. Remove the eyesore or face escalating fines. Before I could respond, she hung up. That evening, as I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee, I noticed Victoria slowly driving past my house. She stopped in front of my driveway, pulled out her smartphone, and began taking photos of the Mustang. Our eyes met, and instead of showing any embarrassment, she gave me a smug smile and waved. I should have recognized the warning signs then, but I was too naive to believe that someone could be so petty over a well-maintained classic car. The following weekend, Victoria marched up my walkway with a middle-aged man in tow. This is Roger from the Architectural Committee, she announced without greeting. We're documenting continued violations. I stood up, trying to keep my composure. Good morning, Victoria. Roger, nice to meet you. I'm still waiting for clarification on which specific bylaw my car is violating. Roger shifted uncomfortably. Well, Section 8.3 mentions vehicles in visible disrepair and commercial vehicles, neither of which applies to my restored classic car, I interjected. I've read our bylaws front to back multiple times. Victoria's face flushed. The board has discretion to interpret community standards, Mr. Hayes. This isn't a courtroom where you can argue technicalities. Actually, I replied, proper procedure and clear interpretation of written rules are important in any organized society. I'm simply asking for consistent application of our agreed-upon covenants. Your car is an eyesore that's reducing property values, she insisted. Multiple neighbors have complained. May I see these complaints? I asked. Our bylaws require documented grievances for violations. Roger shifted uncomfortably again, while Victoria's eyes narrowed. Those records are confidential. The fine is now $100 per day, retroactive to the first notice. Without another word, they turned and left. I spent the rest of the afternoon knocking on neighbors' doors. Not one person had complained about my car. In fact, several neighbors admired it and had even asked for rides. Mr. Thompson, the retired mechanic next door, had helped me with some of the restoration work. Something wasn't adding up. The next morning, another notice appeared on my windshield, warning of imminent towing if the vehicle wasn't removed within 24 hours. I immediately sent a certified letter to the HOA board, formally contesting the violation and requesting proper documentation. I also installed a security camera focused on my driveway. Something told me I might need evidence soon. A few days later, I had to leave town for a judicial conference in Chicago. I considered moving the Mustang to a storage facility, but decided against it on principle. I refused to be bullied over something that wasn't actually violating any rules. I asked Mr. Thompson to keep an eye on things while I was away. 3 days later, I received a frantic call from Mr. Thompson. "Jonathan, they towed your car this morning. That Victoria woman was here with a tow truck at 7 a.m. I tried to stop them, but she had some paperwork she claimed gave them authority. I took pictures with my phone. My heart raced as I booked the next flight home. When I arrived, I drove straight to the impound lot, only to discover that my car wasn't there. According to their records, the Mustang had been claimed by the HOA through something called abandoned property disposition after being impounded for just 24 hours. That's impossible, I told the clerk. It wasn't abandoned. It was illegally towed from my private property while I was out of town for work. The clerk looked uncomfortable. Sir, we just store the vehicles. If someone comes with the right paperwork, we have to release it. You'll need to talk to whoever authorized the tow. I stormed into the HOA office, demanding answers. The receptionist informed me that Victoria was out for the day, but confirmed that my car had been processed according to HOA bylaws regarding abandoned vehicles. She handed me a copy of an auction notice. My stomach dropped as I read it. My father's Mustang had been sold at a private auction for $7,500, a fraction off its $7,500, a fraction off its $60,000 value, just that morning. Who purchased it? I asked, my voice barely controlled. I'm not authorized to disclose that information, she replied, avoiding my gaze. I need to see the documentation authorizing this sale immediately, I insisted. You'll have to file a formal request with the board. The standard processing time is 30 days. I placed my business card on her desk. Please inform Mrs. Langston that Judge Jonathan Hayes will be filing an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning if all documentation isn't on my desk by 9 a.m. Make sure she understands this is not a request. The receptionist's eyes widened as she finally made the connection. You're a judge? Yes, I replied. And while I've tried to resolve this reasonably as a neighbor, it appears the HOA prefers the legal route. Please make that call now. That evening, I reviewed my security camera footage, which clearly showed the tow truck removing my car without proper notice. I also collected statements from 5 neighbors confirming they had never complained about my vehicle. By morning, I had the framework for not just an injunction, but a substantial lawsuit for illegal conversion of property, procedural violations, and fraudulent misrepresentation. At 8:45 a.m., my doorbell rang. Victoria stood there, a manila envelope in her hands and a sour expression on her face. You should have mentioned you were a judge, she said accusingly. You never asked about my profession, Victoria, I replied. And more importantly, my occupation shouldn't matter. The HOA is required to follow proper procedures with all residents. She thrust the envelope at me. Here's your documentation. The car has already been sold, so there's nothing to be done now. I took the envelope but didn't open it. Who purchased the car, Victoria? She hesitated. My brother-in-law. He's a collector and recognized the value opportunity. The pieces suddenly clicked. This had never been about community standards. It was a scheme to acquire a valuable classic car for pennies on the dollar. So you personally benefited from the illegal seizure and sale of my property, I said calmly. That's very interesting. For the first time, uncertainty flashed across her face. The procedure was completely legitimate under our bylaws. We'll let the court decide that, I replied. Please inform your brother-in-law that the vehicle he purchased was stolen property sold without legitimate authority. He should prepare to return it immediately. He's already transported it to his home in Tennessee, she said with a hint of smugness. Returning it won't be easy. I nodded thoughtfully. Interstate transport of stolen property? That elevates things considerably. Thank you for that information. The color drained from her face. Are you threatening me? Not at all, I replied. I'm simply informing you of the legal implications of your actions. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some calls to make. My first call was to my colleague, Judge Martin, in the county where Victoria's brother-in-law lived. My second was to the State Attorney General's office, where I still had contacts from my prosecutor days. By that afternoon, local police had located and impounded my Mustang pending investigation. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that weekend, conspicuously without Victoria present. They were suddenly very concerned about procedural irregularities and potential liability issues. I attended with my attorney, a specialist in property law who happened to be a car enthusiast himself. "Gentlemen, ladies," I began, "I've spent over 30 years upholding the law, first as an attorney, then as a judge. I understand the value of rules and governance. What I witnessed here wasn't governance. It was theft disguised as procedure." The board members squirmed uncomfortably as I laid out the multiple violations of state property law, HOA procedural requirements, and potentially criminal actions involved in the seizure and sale of my vehicle. "We were under the impression that proper notices had been issued," one board member offered weakly. My attorney slid copies of the security footage stills across the table. My client received one warning with no specifics about the alleged violation, followed by a towing notice less than 48 hours later. The vehicle was then towed while he was away, held for just 1 day instead of the legally required 30, and sold to the HOA president's family member for less than 15% of market value. No effort was made to contact the owner despite having his contact information on file. Another board member paled. "We didn't authorize any of this." Victoria said she was handling a routine abandoned vehicle case. "That's interesting," I replied, "because the documentation I received clearly has board approval signatures, including yours, Mr. Phillips." He stammered. "I never read. I trusted." The meeting ended with the board offering to cover the full market value of my car, plus my legal expenses. I declined. "This isn't about money," I said. "It's about abuse of power and violation of trust. I want my car returned, a formal apology issued to the community, and Victoria Langston's immediate removal from the board." 2 days later, my Mustang was back in my driveway. The HOA issued a community-wide notice acknowledging serious procedural violations and announcing a special election to replace the entire board. Victoria resigned before she could be removed, but that didn't spare her from the consequences of her actions. The district attorney declined to press criminal charges after Victoria agreed to pay substantial restitution and perform 200 hours of community service. However, her real estate license was suspended pending a state ethics investigation. Apparently, this wasn't her first exploit in questionable property dealings. The most satisfying moment came during the HOA's special election meeting, where I was unexpectedly nominated to serve on the new board. As I stood to address the packed community center, I noticed Victoria slipping into the back row. "I've spent my career ensuring that rules are applied fairly and transparently," I told my neighbors. "I believe in governance that serves the community, not personal interests. Our HOA should protect our neighborhood's value and character while respecting individual property rights. We can have beautiful, well-maintained homes without resorting to petty tyranny." The applause was gratifying, but the look on Victoria's face as she realized her community's standing was irreparably damaged was the true vindication. That weekend, I invited the entire neighborhood to an informal driveway gathering beside my now-famous Mustang. Over 40 neighbors showed up, many bringing their own classic cars or unique vehicles they had previously hidden in garages for fear of HOA reprisals. Mr. Thompson brought his restored 1955 Chevy, and Mrs. Chun proudly displayed her custom-painted Volkswagen Beetle. As we shared stories and admired each other's prized possessions, a new sense of community emerged, one based on sharing our passions rather than policing our differences. Even Roger from the architectural committee showed up, somewhat sheepishly, in his vintage Corvette. "I always wanted to drive it more," he confessed, but Victoria said it would violate the community aesthetic. I handed him a soda. "Well, it looks like our community aesthetic just got a lot more interesting and authentic." 6 months later, our new HOA board has rewritten the bylaws with clear, reasonable guidelines that protect property values without micromanaging residents' lives. We've established transparent procedures with multiple checks and balances to prevent future abuses. Most importantly, we've created a community mediation process that encourages neighbors to talk through concerns before filing formal complaints. My Mustang still sits in my driveway most weekends, though now it's often joined by other classic cars as our informal car club has become a neighborhood fixture. Sometimes, I take the local kids for rides around the block, building new memories with my father's beloved car. As for Victoria, I hear she's moved to a condominium downtown, one without an HOA. The irony isn't lost on any of us. Sometimes, the most important legal lessons happen outside the courtroom, right in our own driveways. Every time I pull into my driveway now, I think about how close I came to losing a piece of my father's legacy, but also about the unexpected ways this conflict strengthened my connection to my community. My car isn't just parked in my driveway anymore. It's home, exactly where it belongs. A symbol of standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to back down. And if you're wondering what happened to that vehicle of unusual appearance clause in our HOA bylaws, we clarified it to apply only to vehicles that are actually in disrepair or abandoned. Because sometimes, the things that make our neighborhood special are precisely those unique treasures we each bring to it, even if they happen to have four wheels and a story behind them. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.